It's a high-tech conversation.
And a low-tech topic.
Live on the World Wide Web via Zoom. Bench Talk 101.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bench Talk 101. This week, we're joined by Mattias, who's going to talk about some model boat building. So I'm going to swiftly move over to Mattias. And over to you.
Thank you, Shrenik. So yes, and thank you and welcome everyone. Shiver me tiny timbers. I'm going to talk about a model I built some years ago, 2013 to 2015, of a Clyde puffer. And before we dive into that, hang on a second. Yeah, sorry, here we go. What is a Clyde puffer anyway? And why is it called that? I'm sure most of the Brits on the talk will know already, but as not everyone on the talk is a Brit, I thought I'd run through it quickly. So Clyde, because of a very strong association with Glasgow, with the River Clyde, the Firth of Clyde, and the general west coast of Scotland. And puffer, because the very earliest boats which were built to be used on the canals did not have condensing steam engines, but non-condensing ones, so that the exhaust steam was sent up the funnel together with the smoke, which meant that everything came out in puffs together with a puffing sound. And so in popular parlance, they became known as puffers. And it stuck, even though as soon as they left the canals and became seagoing, they had to switch to condensing engines, because as long as you're on sweet water, it's fine to be non-condensing because you have an endless supply of water just over the gunnels. Once you're in salt water, you don't want to run that into your boiler, so you need a condensing engine, otherwise you will run through your water supply very quickly. Anyway, these vessels were around from the earliest ones on the canals, mid-19th century. The real heyday was from the late 19th until the second half of the 20th century. The puffer trade officially disappeared in 1993 when the government stopped subsidizing the shippers. And they no longer could compete with the Calmac ferries and road transport. But in their heyday, their main function, or one of their main functions, was to service the islands and those parts of the highlands that you could most easily reach by sea, and particularly with bulk cargoes, so coal, stone, timber, whatever. But also not so much passengers, although that certainly happened, I'm sure. And also someone needed a piano brought to Jura, someone needed something else heavy brought from this island to that island. The puffers were around. They usually had a four-man crew, skipper, engineer, mate, and deckhand in that order of hierarchy and importance. They were flat-bottomed, so because they came from barges, but also because that way they could be beached and unloaded at low tide. It was very much a working class job. It was pretty hard because, particularly on those islands where there were no piers and no facilities, unloading and loading had to be done with 1-ton buckets that were filled by the crew using shovels. Eventually, also during the Second World War, several hundred similar vessels were built on the order of the Admiralty to serve as inshore victualling vessels. And after the war, they were sold off to private shippers, and that sort of prolonged the steam part of the puffer trade. Although from the 1950s onwards, mid-1950s onwards, most of them were either converted to diesel or replaced by more modern and often larger diesel-powered coastal vessels. And finally, the classic puffers were either 66 feet long, in which case they would fit in the locks in the Forth and Clyde Canal, or 88 feet long, in which case they would fit at least into the locks of the Crinan Canal. Also, to a UK audience, is it switched? Let's see. am I not? All right, let's use the arrows instead. There we go. So to at least a UK audience, puffers are also a very important part of popular culture from the Parahandy stories written by a man called Neil Munro under the pseudonym of Hugh Fowlis. These were short comic stories originally published in the Glasgow Evening newspaper between roughly 1905 and 1925. They were later collected into books, and they were also made into a film in the 1950s and several TV series in the 60s, 70s, and even 1990s. And here I've asked Scott if he would be kind enough to read the quotation I have included from the very first Parahandy story, because his accent is fit for the purpose, mine isn't. Scott, if you would be so kind.
Not a problem. If you never saw the vital spark, she is an owl hold, with the boiler behind, 4 men and a derrick, and a water butt and a pan loaf on the fossicle. Oh man, she was a beauty. She was a beauty. She was just sublime. She should be carrying nothing but gentry for passengers or nice genteel luggage for the shooting lodges. But there they would be spoiling her and rubbing all the paint off her with their coals and sand and whinstone and oak bark and timber and trash like that.
Thank you very much, Scott. And that is a pretty, so these stories really, their humor particularly depends on the dialogue and on the characters. It's not so much situation driven. It's not so much really the puffer trade is basically an excuse for having characters exchange funny dialogue or funny monologues. But anyway, if you're interested in the real in the puffers and in the background, there are a lot of photos available from the Scottish Maritime Museum. They have a Flickr album. There's also a complete index of all known puffers and VICs. If you really want to go down that particular rabbit hole. But now over to my part of the talk. So basically, when it comes to model boats and woodworking, you can do a rough division into 3 classes of woodwork. One is structural, not meant to be seen, so that's usually plywoods, whatever you have. It's to create a framework or a structure or something that will either be painted or covered with something else, but made to be carried stuff. Then you have what I would call imitational woodwork. So whether it's real wood or other materials made to look like wood, it looks like the real thing more or less on the surface, but there are no real joints. It's usually put together with glue. And then you have the real woodwork, which I am not unfortunately going to be talking about because that was never involved in this particular build. I have plans for such builds in the future, but I haven't built one yet, where basically you attempt to the best of your ability to do at a smaller scale exactly the same that they do at full size. And should anyone be interested in that particular rabbit hole, which is a very interesting one, the books in the photo, which have been continuously published since the 1950s when they first came out, are a fantastic starting point. So anyway, also before we get into the actual model, the build scenario, I always try to imagine a situation for a model, to have a story around it so that when I need to take decisions on this, that, or the other, I have something to judge those decisions by. So for this particular build, this was my basic scenario. It's Monday, June the 4th, 1951, has just gone 10 o'clock in the morning. And the puffer Elan Mor, and Elan Mor is Gaelic and means big isle. It's a very common name in the Scottish archipelagos. Wherever you have a group of skerries or islands, the biggest one is often called Ilan Mor. And if you Google it, you will also find that there is a particular one with a lighthouse where 3 lighthouse keepers disappeared mysteriously around the turn of the last century. That's another rabbit hole for people interested in rabbit holes to go down. I have not been down that one because there be not dragons but conspiracy theorists. But anyway, I digress. Ilan Mor has sailed from Glasgow down to Troon and taken on a load of coal for Colonsay in the Hebrides. Monday morning around 7 o'clock, she left Troon and has been doing a steady 6 knots, which is a typical puffer speed across the Firth of Clyde. She is now, as you can see from the chart in the picture, in the Sound of Bute between Bute and Arran, heading for Loch Fyne, and the sea log at Ardrishaig, and the Crinan Canal, which will take her to the other side of the Kintyre Peninsula and is a shortcut towards Colonsay. Sea is calm and the weather is lovely. So first a few words about the kit, because I based this build on a kit from Mountfleet Models in England. It came with a glass fiber hull, also a glass fiber engine room casing, glass fiber jolly boat, a couple of resin cast crew members, some plywood, sheets of plywood, some loose timber, various other materials, and 11 bags of white metal castings, also a brass propeller. And to put this all together, of course, I used tools. I figured I'd bring that one in early because I think this is a subject that is of some interest to people here. Mainly hand tools, needle files, tweezers, scalpels, pin vices. There is a small precision set of scales, which is something that is extremely useful both for mixing paints so that you can get exactly the same mix every time, and also for mixing up epoxy in small quantities so that you get the same amount of base and hardener. Soldering iron, airbrushes, because most of the paintwork was done with an airbrush. And then also a few words about just some examples of the basic construction. So here we have typical examples of what I mentioned as structural woodwork. So it's internal, it's to keep things in place. First, a framework to both to be loaded down with lead shot as a ballast as low as possible in the hull, but also to lift everything else up by about, say, 3/8 of an inch or so, so that everything else would be, because eventually you will get water in there, either that you will ship water when you're sailing the boat, or water will come in through the propeller shaft. It's very difficult to stop that, and even if it's not much, you don't want that to hit any of the electrical parts. So to lift all of that up, I then created a sled system across that using curtain rails. I made a sled for the lead battery, because that is a pretty heavy piece of kit. It's about, this of course is a displacement hull, and it displaces a lot of water. In the end, I think the total weight of the model is something like 10 kilos with about 6 kilos worth of ballast. And you want to keep the ballast as low as possible, of course, so that you get a nice low point of gravity, center point of gravity. So I also used a couple of copper pipes filled with lead shot again that can be moved back and forth so that you can balance the thing. Also the battery slides so that you can use that to fine tune the balancing. Then there's the next set of structural woodwork, which is the frame to support the deck, and some simple plywood overlays to create the basic deck structure on which the show deck will then be built. Also a simple framework in the middle there to hold the rudder servo. And of course, a fair amount of filler and sanding, and more filler and sanding, and filling in holes in the casting, and then airbrush painting the hull. So the first piece where you get to imitation woodwork is when it came to planking the deck. So the kit came with pre-printed plywood overlays with a plank pattern and various other things printed onto them. I didn't very much like the look of them, and also, as you can see from the lower picture, the foredeck overlay didn't actually fit very well. It's too wide in the waist and too narrow up towards the bow. So I decided to instead do a loose plank deck myself. So I started with figuring out the basic shapes, and also experimented with various butt shift patterns. So the butt shift is how often the butts of the planks line up. You can have a 3-butt shift. This is a 4-butt shift, and you want to have. This model is not of an existing ship, so it's a generic puffer. So I do have some freedom. There is not a prototype where you can actually count the rivets and check the butt pattern, but still you want to work with realistic lengths of plank and realistic widths of plank compared to scale. So I did all of that layout work, and then went on to start the planking. I used sycamore, so European maple, and to create an imitation of the caulking for the seams, I used black cartridge paper. It doesn't create it half creates dust when you sand it down, but eventually once you get down past the bit sticking out, it cleans up pretty nicely. I also used 1mm walnut dowel to create the imitation of the fasteners. So on this kind of ship that has a basic deck made out of metal and just planking laid on top because that's nicer to walk on and nicer to look at, those planks will be fastened down. They will be bolted down to the metal deck, and the holes so the countersunk part of those holes at the top of the planks will then be filled with plugs to make it watertight and make it look nicer. I used walnut. It would probably have been more correct to use sycamore dowel, but I couldn't find any, and at that time I did not have a draw plate that was small enough to produce it, so I compromised and went with walnut. Same with the foredeck. So also all the surrounds for the various parts of fixed deck furniture, like bollards and skylights. And as you can see, some of the planks took a fair amount of shaping. Every single plank is an individual one, so there's no cheating in that respect. And they had to be shaped pretty carefully to fit around the deck furniture surrounds. And in the end, this was the result. Next big job which was a mix of structure and imitation work, was the cargo hatch. So the basic structure is just is just a box made out of plywood. At one end, because I was planning to show part of the cargo of coal exposed for reasons of the story that I'm going to come to. So I cut off part of the plywood lid and replaced that with a shallow well. I also made up the stringers on which the hatch cover planks would rest. Again, they are fake in the sense that they don't go all the way, because not all the hatch will be exposed, but sufficient to. Then you put I put the detailing on, painted it black. I also used sanding filler to make the wood look less like wood and more like painted metal. Then created a set of the part of the planks that can be covered by tarpaulin. It's just a sheet of plywood that's been scored, and the rest are loose planks also made from plywood. And then I did get a couple of lumps of real coal with the kit, but that was not enough to fill the void entirely. So I started with some gravel, some garden gravel, painted that in various shades of black and gray, and then topped up with the crushed coal, secured with thin watered down PVA. I also made a set of wedges, and from some brass rod I made imitation iron bars that would be used to secure the tarpaulin. And for the tarpaulin, in the end, I experimented with various materials, but I ended up using something called light span, which is a material used on light radio-controlled model aircraft. It's usually heat shrunk, but I obviously haven't done that. It is historically dubious because it looks more like a modern tarpaulin, an artificial material tarpaulin. Those were available in the 1950s, but it's most likely that a ship like this would have used a waxed cotton tarpaulin, but I couldn't find any material that looked the part. So next big job was the wheelhouse. Again, as you can see from the top left-hand picture, it was supposed to be made up of pre-printed plywood. Bother that, I said to myself. So instead I made a basic structure out of plywood indeed, with cutouts for the door, cutouts for the windows. I then framed that with short lengths of timber and clad it on the outside, both on the outside and on the inside, with thin strips of sycamore that I then stained oak color, painted white on the inside. And as you can see from the picture in the lower left-hand corner, at the top, I left an opening between the outside and the inside of the frame, so that I would be able to slide down the window frames when I got to that point. I also made a detachable roof that in the end was secured. These pictures are before it was secured, but in the end I secured it with some neodymium magnets at the corners to make sure it wouldn't blow off while sailing. And I then also made a door and windows. So the door, a frame build, again out of sycamore, stained oak, everything of course gloss varnished to imitate boat varnish, spar varnish. I also used some doll's house fittings, small, what you call it, hinges, a sliding lock, a doorknob that I mortised into the frame, and also mortised into the jamb of the door opening. For the windows, I stained several lengths of the same thin sycamore timber and cut it to mitered lengths, which I then glued up into twice the number of frames that I needed for windows. I then put a spacer made out of the same black cartridge paper in the middle, put in a small pane of real glass. It is microscopic slide cover glass, which is almost sufficiently thin to be to scale, and then glued together two frames with the glass and the spacer in the middle, and varnished those. And I then just slid them in from the top, so that, and for two of them I had created cutouts in the original plywood former so that they could be set in an open position, create a bit more variation, and also it's quite realistic. It would be an efficient way. It would be useful for the skipper, both to get air into the wheelhouse, but also so that he can lean his head out of the window and shout at his crew members when they are doing something they shouldn't or not doing something they should. And then the interior detailing of the wheelhouse, a few details about that. So first up, the binnacle, because I wanted to add the light to the binnacle. I first put it on a piece of brass tubing to contain the grain of wheat bulb and the heat from that. Added a compass rose covered with a piece of microscopic glass, and also put another microscopic glass cover in the binnacle opening. Then built an octagonal tube to go around the brass tube, which I then stained mahogany. As for the steering wheel, that was a white metal casting, needed some repair and some fettling. But then after a primer and a base coat of light brown, I used oil paints to do imitation woodwork, and then picked out the brass details in brass paint. So again, this is what I meant with imitation woodwork. It's made to look like wood, but it isn't even real wood. Whereas the rest of the wheelhouse is real wood, but it is not constructed with proper joints. It's all glued together and made to look reasonably close to the genuine structure. Also a small chart table for the wheelhouse. Again, no real joinery, so there are no mortises and tenons on those legs and rails. But again, it looks as though there would be. Made from sycamore, stained mahogany, a small brass undercarriage to create, that should have been a drawer, because that's how you usually keep charts, but I didn't feel up to making a drawer, so I cheated on that one and made a shelf out of thin brass wire instead. A clock and barometer set. They're actually made from brass portholes turned backwards, and then printouts glued onto that, and imitation bezels glued on top of that. And as you can see, it's 10:10, so that is why I said that they'd left Troon at 7 o'clock in the morning and doing 6 knots an hour, are 18 nautical miles further, i.e. now in the Sounds of Bute. There's also a set of parallel rulers, and also a small pencil, which is actually a working pencil because it's made from a 0.5 millimeter piece of lead for a propelling pencil that I then sanded hexagonal, sanded a point on one end, and painted everything except the very tip. And as you can see, it's about, I think it's about 8 millimeters long and about half a millimeter thick. Also, in those days, most everyone was a smoker, and a typical working man's cigarette in Britain in the 1950s would have been wild woodbine. I was very lucky someone on eBay was selling a wild woodbine packet from that era, because the design, the brand existed from around 1900 up until the 1970s or 80s, and the packaging changed. But someone was selling a complete packet and had taken high resolution photos of every possible side of that packet. So I was able to recreate that. I then shrunk the images down and had them printed by a photo developing company on photographic paper, peeled off the top layer, because a regular household printer is nowhere near detailed enough to give something that looks like the real thing. Also, a packet of Swan Vestas matches. It's interesting that actually the matchbox those dummies are to the real size, and the matchbox is the same size as the cigarette packet. Made some cigarette ends from 0.2 millimeter brass wire painted white, and then put all of those things together with the charts on the chart table. And again, the charts, the National Library of Scotland have a very extensive collection of Admiralty charts, and they also have an on-demand scan service. So I was able to order a number of charts that would have been the latest charts for the area in 1951, which is why I settled for 1951, not 1952, not 1950, because the charts I was able to get would only have been a correct set in 1951. Some of them would have been out of date in 1952 or not yet published in 1950, and I wasn't able to get the ones that would have been then. So a few words. This is hardly any wood at all, because this is a steam winch, which was all made up out of white metal castings. There was a fair amount of fettling and cleaning work to be done, but also some replacement. The handle for the reverse gear had broken off and needed to be replaced. I used milliput for that. I also created a connecting shaft to connect that lever to the steam boxes. That was very interesting too, because in order to figure out how this kind of steam winch worked, I was able to find online a set of books that were published in the United States during the Second World War for the US Merchant Navy, where they had to turn city slickers and hayseeds into sailors in no time at all to man all the Liberty ships and other cargo ships that were vital to the war effort. And so they basically wrote a set of books that these days would be called Seamanship for Dummies. And they explained in very simple terms a lot of stuff, including how a steam winch of this type would work, including how the steam boxes and the valve sets worked. So while this is not an exact reproduction, at least it's an imitation. The same goes, I added stopcocks to the steam boxes and to the cylinders, because on a steam winch that is used and then not used for a while and then used again, you will get condensate in those areas when the engine cools off. And unless you can drain that off, it might stop the engine from restarting. So, sorry. So this is the end result once it had all been painted and put together. This is also one of the few areas where I did some weathering, so a very mild weathering at that, some oil stains on the lagging of the pipe work and somewhere on the brake pedal. Otherwise, this is an unweathered model. This is then again pure woodwork, the outhouse. I'm not entirely sure that it is appropriate. There are some photos of some puffers where a similar structure on deck can be seen, but I think most of them actually had a facility somewhere below deck. But anyway, the kit came with plywood parts to make one, so I decided to make one anyway. So I first tried steam bending some wood at the right dimension to create the curved back. That didn't work, so in the end I ended up doing a glued lamination of thinner material, and that worked fine. Then clad that with planking and some support framework on the inside, added portholes, added a seat of ease, a bucket under that to receive whatever you are delivering. And here I must apologize. When I did this, I had not yet read the book on door and window making. So one mountain is pointing the right direction, one is pointing in the wrong direction. My sincere apologies to the woodworking community for this error. I did not know any better at the time. Painted that and put it together. Of course, a lavatory needs toilet paper. Toilet paper on rolls were available in the UK in the 1950s, so I did that rather than loose sheets. And I also wanted to have a paper left on the seat from the last visitor. So this is the Glasgow Evening Times from Saturday, June the 2nd, 1951. I was lucky to find a complete scan of that on Google Books and could download that and print it out to scale on the thinnest paper I could find, folded that up and left it with the sports pages foremost. It's very interesting, by the way, those sports pages. The main headline is English soccer prices up. Players' maximum wage now £14 per week. Those were the days. I looked up the statistics, and the average weekly pay in the UK or in England at this time was £7.50 a week, or rather £7.10 a week. So a football player could, the maximum wage a professional football player could earn was twice the average weekly wage. I think that was probably a better time for sport than today. I also quite like the headline, Scottish League's AGM won't be exciting. I wonder why. The text is too small to be able to read, I'm afraid. And some more details. So I decided, because the skipper, or the crew member that I decided to assignate the role of skipper, came with a bottle in his hand. I wanted a label for that bottle. So I looked up various breweries in Scotland in the 1950s and came up with Aitken Brewers in Falkirk. They were a very traditional, they'd been going since the 1700s. They went out of business in the late 60s, early 70s, but at this time they were still booming. They had a 90 shilling ale, that's the 90 shillings is the tax, that had a label that could actually be printed on sliding decals at scale size and still be reasonably readable. At the Falkirk Museums, I also found a photo of an Aitken Brewer's beer crate from the period, including all the measurements. I was able to make some copies of that. And to produce the text, I had a rubber stamp made with the text as close as I could in typefaces and so on that I stamped on, and then I used a satin varnish mixed with some orange paint to create the coloring effect. Here are some more details, some splice work for some of the rope work, the ladder, there's a bench at the stern, and the jolly boat. So again, that was a pretty rough glass fiber casting. I created with no detailing on the inside, so I did that using plastic cards, styrene plastic. That was easier than wood to create an imitation mirror image of the outside planking. And then the thwarts and the bottom boards out of wood. And also the oars I made from scratch myself. So square stock, tapered the end to create lands for the blades. Then I turned the shafts in micro lathe, painted it, put some leather around, and also added chains for the row locks. I've seen that on various jolly boats. It's fairly common to make sure that they don't get lost, either overboard or when handling or stowing the boat. The crew members were pretty rough resin castings. I think pirated from German railroad figures, pretty well to scale, but they needed some work. So the chap who is stealing coal from the cargo to top up the bunkers needed to have his hands replaced. So I gave him brass hooks and then built up the hands around those brass hooks using milliput. Then also used watered down milliput to fill up a lot of the various casting irregularities and then painted them. So here we are. This is the finished product on the water. I'm a member of a model boat club in Mechelen, which is about 15 miles from where I live. But it's a very nice pond, easy to get the boat in and out of the water. And on our reserved times, we have that end of the pond to ourselves. So it's a very nice way of. And to end it all, some moving pictures.
I think I'm filming. Not too good at it.
This, by the way, is not scale speed because I'm filming with my telephone using one hand and controlling the rudder with the other hand. And I'm fairly close to shore. I had to set the speed to above scale speed. Otherwise, the maneuverability would not have been good enough for me to be comfortable with the handling in that sort of situation.
It's what we use.
And here we are 6 months later in autumn at dusk, and with the navigation lights turned on. And those navigation lights, I bought, it's copper etched kit that I bought that is made to have, so it has the correct sectors. So that the top light, I don't remember the exact degrees, but the top light basically only shows to a certain sector towards forwards. And here it's after, when it's almost dark the same evening. So you can see here the boat is heading towards me, and now you can see the top light and the red port light. See, from the sectors of the light, you can judge in which direction a ship is heading. When you can see all three lights, you know that you're seeing it straight on from the side. When you can just see the stern light, you know that the boat is heading away from you. Here it is coming around, and now it is showing green. And now green and top light, so now you know that it's heading, it's crossing your bows, but heading to the right from your point of view. And when it comes round towards you, you can all of a sudden see top light and both the starboard and the port colored lights. Two things I did not do, which you may have noticed here, there's no smoke generator to imitate coal smoke coming out of the funnel, and there's no sound card imitating the sound of a steam engine. But anyway, here we are. So thank you very much for your patience. I'm afraid I've gone a bit over the usual time slot. I hope I haven't driven you all to drink and desperation. Drink is fine, but desperation less so. These final photos are from my birthday, my 50th birthday in 2015, when my wife and I spent a week on board the Vic 32, which is one of the few remaining coal-fired, steam-driven puffers still sailing Scottish waters, sailing around the Loch Fyne, the Kyles of Bute, the Sound of Bute, and in general having a fantastic time. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Mattias. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, and I think everyone's, I would expect everyone's really enjoyed that. So we're going to move on to the questions, as you've just suggested. And if anyone who hasn't joined before doesn't know, if you pop your name in the chat, I'll ask you to unmute and ask your question. So a few people are experts on this and they've already got in very early. Let's move over to Andy Tuckwell.
Okay. Mattias, that was stunning. I'm very glad I managed to join this week and not miss that. The quality of work you've done there, I mean, a long time ago, I used to know a fellow who worked professionally as a model maker for museums.
Yeah.
And he didn't do anything like the level of detail you've done there. He didn't make transfers for beer bottle labels.
That, of course, to some extent, I think, is the difference between a professional and an amateur. The amateur does it for fun, so he can take much more time because there's no one grudging him a paycheck.
I mean, I was going to ask if you'd actually seen the boats themselves and had a particular connection to them, but then you went and answered that anyway.
Yes,
once we started getting the... Sorry.
I hadn't before. So when I started the build, I picked it out because I thought it was, every model I build, I try to find something that is a new challenge to me, something that is comfortable, something that is a challenge. And for this one, it was using glass fiber hull and various other things. So I looked around for kits having a glass fiber hull, and I just like the looks of it. They are cute. I mean, one of the reasons puffers are so popular, part of it is just the sheer vivacity of the Parahandy stories and the various films and TV series made based on that. But a big part of it also is the fact that they are chubby and cute.
Yep, yep. I've seen them on the Crinan Canal, and you know, you're dead right. They are. They've got personality to them.
They've got personality, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, I'm not very keen on. I'm not interested. I don't mind it, but I'm not interested in building warships at all. So I'm always looking for civilian subjects, one way or another. And so I was looking around, and I found this one. I thought, yeah, that'll do. That'll do me.
And I'll just also add that the photos are great too. I mean, there's so many of those where if you hadn't introduced it as being photos of a model, you'd think it was a photo of the real full-size thing. I'm blown away.
Thank
you for sharing that all with us.
You're welcome.
I can see what pleasure you get from it.
I do. Oh, but I do. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
otherwise I wouldn't do that. That model is about 1,200 hours of work over 2 years. So.
Hmm. If I could ask a personal question, have you still got a day job? Are you retired?
Oh yes, I do. I do.
All right.
But the day that I no longer have, oh boy, have I got plans for that.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Andy. Paul?
Hi, Mattias. Fantastic presentation. Unfortunately, I missed the start of it.
Right.
Now, you said that on some of the pieces you didn't do proper joinery.
Yes.
Have you plans to repeat those bits with proper joinery?
Well, not on that model, no, but on some coming work, certainly. So one of the things I'm planning to build, I mean, it's not for tomorrow, it's not even for next week or next year, but one day I'm planning to build, there are plans from the 1950s for a 1:6 scale steam launch called Wide Awake. So it's an open steam launch, and that one is proper clinker build, and at 1:6, it's large enough that real joinery is perfectly feasible. So that is definitely a model I'm planning to build with real, actual joinery.
1:6, would you need a trailer to actually take that to the lake?
No, I don't
big is
think so.
1:6?
It would end up, it would be something, because it's a small steam launch. So essentially it's a steam powered jolly boat. So I think the model, I forget the exact measure, but it ends up about 4 feet long.
Before you build it,
Yeah.
check your boot space.
Yes, absolutely. Well, my current car would not be a problem. Obviously, I have no idea what I'll be driving the day that I actually build it.
Well, at 1,500 hours, if you're doing proper joinery.
Yeah, probably. But I'll enjoy every one of them. That's the point of it.
It'll be an electric car, probably.
Yeah, it will probably. An electric car to carry a steam launch.
So much.
Sorry?
As I said, I missed a lot of the start of it, but what I saw was absolutely stunning.
Thank you.
And it's nice from one of our own. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I was hoping for a few more puns in there. Over to Mitch.
Hi, Mattias. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Absolutely in awe of the detail that you put in there.
Thank you.
My only question really is, you had a figure that you said had lost its hands and was now stealing coal after you put hands back on again.
Yes.
So I was wondering whether you had any intention on chopping his hands off again.
Exactly. No. Well, from what I read, there's a book by a chap called, let's see, I've got it here. I mean, it's not the most fantastic of books. It's a fellow called Keith McGinn, who wrote a book called Last of the Puffermen. And he started on the puffers in 1965. And he tells, at least the way he tells the story, and I've read it elsewhere as well, is that pinching coal from the cargo to top up the bunkers and to feed the stove in the galley was considered a perk.
Ah, so that's okay.
So and because it's, as it were, it's nice. I mean, the kit came with a piece of real coal because you might want to show the cargo, but you have to have a reason to show the cargo. It is, well, also from what I've read, when the weather was nice, sometimes they didn't bother with the extra work of actually putting the hatch covers and the tarpaulin over the cargo. They just sailed with an open hatch, and if they weren't worried about the weather, that was fine. But in that case, I would have needed much more coal, and in that case, the tarpaulin should just have been stored in a corner, and the hatch board should also have been stowed away. So I needed to come up with a credible reason why the tarpaulin had been peeled back and some of the hatch covers had been lifted off. And so I used that story from Keith McGinn's book about the perk of stealing coal, and the fact also that this figure happened to be in a shoveling position. Also, you have to come up with a reason to have someone standing at that position holding an implement of some kind.
Absolutely. Well, it's brilliant. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Mitch. Over to Chester.
Oh, hey, that was excellent.
Thank you.
Am I unmuted? I guess I think
You are. I can hear you.
Yeah. That was delightful. It reminded me of I think it's Madurodam in Amsterdam, the miniature city that they have there that you can walk around. I don't really have a question for you. I started off my woodworking making ship models. That's what I started, collecting logs and making ship models.
Yep.
When I was around 7, 6 or 7, and so the detail is really beautiful. And then some of the earliest work that I had in film was as a model maker, making miniature buildings and boats and cars and putting little lights on models and things like that. So your detail was exceptional, and it's really quite good enough for film work in doing miniatures. So you might want to consider that as a second career when you're done with this sort of messing around for a little bit of money, because it pays very well, and your attention to detail is phenomenal. I just wanted to compliment you and thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you very much, Chester.
Very nice.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chester. Thanks, Chester. Over to Ian.
Hi, Mattias.
Hello, Ian.
I have seen that before over the net, but it's wonderful to see it up close like that. That was brilliant. And I particularly love some of the effort you made, with the newspaper and the woodbines. I mean, I remember woodbines as a kid. All the working men seemed to smoke woodbines at that time. And that pencil I thought that was brilliant, making a pencil. There was a control in the wheelhouse, a red horizontal. What does that do?
So if you mean the hand wheel?
Yeah, the hand wheel, yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's a steam regulator. So you can normally, so these boats, as I said, had a 4-man crew. So you would have a skipper, an engineer, a mate, and a deckhand. And while sailing, the engineer's place, so that you can only see 3 men on the ship, because of course the engineer is in the engine room, where he's making sure that the engine keeps running, and also shovels coal onto the boiler fire at regular intervals. By the way, between brackets, when we went on the Vic 32, you were allowed to join in basically every piece of work on board, except putting coal on the boiler fire.
Right.
The engineer was very particular about that, because he said that is not just a question of shoveling coal here, there, and it's an art to use the right amount of coal to get the right amount of heat, to get the right amount of steam for the job of work you need to do.
Right.
And so he was happy to have you down in the engine room and looking at things and talking to him, but you were not allowed to shovel coal onto the fire.
Right.
But anyway, so
that red wheel, did that control speed then?
Yes. So essentially, it is. So you have, and the Vic 32 had the same controls. So the skipper, if the engineer needed to, for instance, be up at the front running the steam winch, you could control the steam regulator, the steam valve from from the wheelhouse, and you could also put her into reverse. You could control the reversing gear from the wheelhouse.
Right.
And they did that. I mean, when they, for instance, you were coming into a lock, for instance, the engineer might need to be throw a hawser to someone on shore, or do some other piece of work. So couldn't be down in the engine room running the controls.
Yeah. The decking, this thin sycamore, was this a veneer, or was it that?
No, it's sycamore planks, so loose sycamore planks, and it's model timber.
Oh, right.
So
how did you get on with that black cartridge paper? If it gets damp, or is the deck peeled,
that's
or?
not. I mean, it's varnished.
Varnished, right?
Let's put it this way: it should not sit out in the rain.
No.
But the minimal amount of water that ends up on deck during normal sail is not a problem.
Yeah.
Because it's varnished. I used a satin varnish, so it doesn't show up. It's not a high gloss varnish,
right?
But there are, I think, 6 or 7 coats of varnish on top of that.
Yeah. I love the way your mind has worked on all that detail. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Jim?
Yeah, I can only echo what everybody else has said, Mattias. It's incredible work, the detail, fantastic. I know I always had an aspiration to actually make a full-size steamboat, like a Windermere steamboat, as a standard engine. When you make your 1/6 scale copy, will you be making a scale steam engine for it?
Yes. In the best of worlds, yes.
Good.
It will depend. As of yet, I don't own a metal lathe. I don't own a what's the word? A mill. So I haven't got a milling machine, and I haven't got a metal lathe. Those are on my shopping list. Now I've deviated. I've gone down a woodworking rabbit hole, and there are lots of tools you can buy for woodworking. So my budget has been going astray for a certain amount of time. But yes, so there are. It's not unlikely, because the plans that I was talking about which are, I think, from the 1950s, are planned around the Stuart D10.
Yeah.
And you can buy a ready-made Stuart D10, but you can also buy it as rough castings. And I would love to buy that as rough castings and finish that. Or if I've already tried my hand at metalwork and found that I'm sufficiently good at it, I might go out on a limb and try to make a steam engine from scratch, although I'm not sure about that. It's I've never tried it. I've always wanted to. I mean, a steam engine has been on my bucket list. Sorry, I hate the word bucket list. Has been on my to-do list since I was about 8 or 10 years old. So it would be a dream come true, but exactly how I go about it remains to be seen.
That's really good, because I think that's the next step if you're going to that sort of size and detail of actually doing the wooden joinery. To have an RC, well, it will be RC anyway, but just on the controls, as it were.
Exactly.
Just on the same subject of steam, the steam winch that you did a fabulous job of, is that, I presume, because I don't know enough about these puffers, I presume that's used to raise and lower the davit when they're offloading cargo.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So it's for raising and lowering the anchor.
Right.
So there's a gypsy wheel for that you can put the anchor chain over, and that will bring up the anchor. You don't need it to lower it, because the anchor lowers itself with the help of gravity. And then but the main function is indeed to raise and lower the derrick.
Yeah.
Because that was one of the things about these ships. They were self-contained units of work.
Sure.
And particularly out on the Scottish Islands, there were very few facilities. There were no piers. They would often have to be, well, I mean, you can see the book I was showing, Keith McGinn's book, that is a beached puffer being unloaded.
So what would you use? Some form of sack that you fill the coal in the
they
sack
usually used a 1 ton, so an imperial ton bucket.
Oh, right. Okay.
So a huge metal bucket, a huge iron bucket that you would fill up with coal or whatever the cargo was that you were carrying. And that was one of the reasons why the puffer trade was considered pretty low grade as seagoing jobs went, because it involved a lot of backbreaking labor, because it would be, the crew would be involved, all of the crew members would be involved in that.
Yeah.
So taking on the cargo, they usually did in the major ports, so Glasgow, Greenock, Ayr, Troon, and there were facilities. They would have chutes, and the railroad cars with coal would come right up to the quayside and could basically be tipped into the hold more or less. But there they had facilities for loading, but for unloading or for loading cargoes out on the islands, they were often forced back to manual labor, and although the locals would also pitch in, the crew was certainly expected to help out.
That's another fascinating. I'm going to have to go and look up puffers now. Thank you so much. It's been,
you're welcome.
It's amazing how Bench Talk deviates from the standard woodworking, and this has been an absolute dream. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Over to Eric.
Thanks, Mattias. That was really interesting. It's fascinating, your attention to detail. I'm not sure I've got the patience to do something like that. I share your aspiration to make a steam engine. I always fancied doing that. I wanted to get one of these mammoth steam traction engines that you could get fired up with meths. My mother would never let me have one. She thought it was too dangerous. So didn't manage to avoid danger entirely. A few years after that, I managed to set fire to the bedroom with some fireworks, but that's another story. But I did have a question as well about the puffers. Something that always puzzled me about them was how seaworthy they actually were. You know, because you get some quite big seas going out to the islands, and they had a flat bottom, which doesn't sort of lend itself to being that stable. I wouldn't have thought, particularly once you'd get rid of the cargo. Were there a lot of shipwrecks from them?
Not really. I mean, there were certainly a few that sunk, but that was mainly from accidents and collisions. No, they were. I mean, part of it was it's inshore trade, so they would never be that far away from a cove or a harbour in case the weather turned very nasty very quickly. And the other thing is they are actually surprisingly. I mean, as I said at the end, I went on one in 2015 for my 50th, and although that one, she's riding fairly high in the water because, of course, she's been converted to take passengers. So there's, of course, she's ballasted, but it's not. So that's another detail, by the way. I didn't mention that when I talked about painting the hull. The waterline is just a suggestion. So there is a red bottom and a black top, but the line between the two is not does not represent a real water line in any sense. And most of the photos you see, it's the same. It's just a mechanical line, because sometimes they would be loaded basically literally down to the gunnels. There are photos where the freeboard is measured in inches.
Gosh.
And which was fine as long as the weather stayed calm. And then you see them when they're running empty, or when they have only cargo towards the back of the hole, and you can see them basically leaning out of the water like this. That flicker site from the Scottish Maritime Museum is very much worth a visit. There are some fascinating photos there. But anyway, so they are surprisingly stable. I think also because they have a very low center of gravity. A lot of the weight of the hull is under the water. The engine sits very low in the hull. The water tanks and the bunkers are low in the hull. And of course, the vast majority of the space inside the hull is just a cargo hold. And once there is cargo in, it was, and we had some, during my trip with the Vic 32, we did have some rough weather. That photo of me at the wheel It's not a post one, it's a real one. I'm taking a trick at the wheel for real. And that was quite an exercise, because on the steam puffers, the diesel puffers have the funnel behind the wheelhouse, but the steam puffers have the funnel in front of the wheelhouse, in the middle. So you have to keep jumping back and forth to look at to starboard, to look out to port, to look out to starboard. And because these are inshore waters, so there are sailing boats, there are other craft, and there are bloody lobster pots. You would not know.
So, yeah.
And you don't have to snag the propeller in a lobster pot line.
No.
So there was a lot of jumping back and forth to keep an eye on what you were, at the same time as an amateur, trying to keep the wake behind you as straight as you could. Because of course a zigzag wake is not an efficient use of coal.
No, indeed, no. Helming something that looks very simple. It was the first time I tried it. It was described to me as just being like driving a car. No, it's not. I can keep the car on the right side of the road without any bother, but not about keeping it going straight.
And it's also very interesting because the Vic 32, same as many puffers had, so there's a chain gear. Taking the movements of the steering wheel down to the rudder at the stern, and there's a lot of slop in that, and that is on purpose. I mean, we were told explicitly before helming that if a wave hits the rudder, it's a big rudder, you just step back and let go, because if you try to hold on to that, you can have your hand broken. If a rogue wave, those are big rudders and they are external. They're astern of the stern. So if a big wave hits that, bang, and the wheel would just turn. And it's better to go off course than to have a paying passenger with a broken hand.
Indeed, yes.
Or at least some very nice bruises.
All right, so well, great. So look forward to your next model. We'll see. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Over to Richard Hughes.
Good evening. Thanks for your presentation. It was really enjoyable. Just for making your next model, I just wanted to encourage you to make the steam engine. This one here I made. It's a Stuart 10.
Stuart,
Stuart 10V. I made this one at the time I made this. I only had a very small lathe, and so it is. Engines of this type can be made on quite modest machinery.
That's very good to know. I mean, I had understood that to be the case, but of course, it's always anything you haven't really tried. It's always looks daunting.
The flywheel is the governing factor. It's the center height of the lathe must be a bit
large enough to
it must be a bit greater than the diameter than the radius of the flywheel.
So do you run that one on steam or on compressed air?
On compressed air, yeah. I could probably reset it going if you like.
I've always had a fascination with steam. I've loved it for as long as I can remember.
We go.
Yep. Indeed. Lovely.
We've got a reversing gear here. We can hopefully set it going the other way.
It's really, really, really pretty.
So yeah, it's a fun thing.
You made that one from the rough castings?
Rough castings, yeah. The Stewart kits, it's a very, you have to do almost all the work. Yeah. You get the rough castings and some materials, or some of the models you just get the castings, and you have to obtain the materials you need. Yeah, it's a fun thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for showing me that.
Thanks, Richard. Chester, you had a second question.
No, not a second question. I wanted to tell Mattias what I used on my models for movies. For the smoke, they sell what's called a smoke cookie, and it's about the size of a large chocolate chip cookie, and you can buy different ones of them. They're not to be used inside, although 20 years ago we used to waft the smoke around a room in order to fill up a room like a bar scene. And they're just about a 5-inch cookie, and you take off a little piece of it, just like a regular edible cookie, and you can put it in that stovepipe of the ship and use a little electronic lighter to ignite it, and it will smoke for just a little piece of it will smoke for probably 2 to 3 minutes and give you a real billowing of smoke. We used to use the pills from the Lionel trains, but that required a heat pan that you had to heat up underneath it. But with those cookies, you don't need anything. All you need to do is to suspend it in there with you could even do a remote control wire. On Crimes of the Heart, Sissy Spacek was supposed to burn some waffles. And as it turned out, you can't burn waffles. They take, and at 2 hours, they'll turn brown, but they don't smoke. And they wanted smoke. So I rigged these coils in underneath the waffle iron with these cookie pieces, and then black smoke can come out. But you can buy it. It's white smoke, gray smoke, all these different colors, and you just buy them and you could just insert them when you want.
Interesting. I mean, if you wanted to be really, really, really accurate, you should need a white smoke and a black smoke, because a coal-fired steam engine, when the fire is just going, you get a fairly thin white grayish smoke. But then when they put on new coal to stoke up the fire, then you get about a minute or so of very black, quite acrid smoke, and then it settles down again.
So it's like the papal decision making, whether it's black smoke or white smoke.
Sort of, yeah. Except that they have a new pope most of the time, but ever so often they don't.
Right. But if you can't find those cookies, I might be able to find them for you and ship them. But I'm sure there's a prop house somewhere over there.
There must be.
You can buy them from.
I will look into that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just thought that might be a nice feature just for maybe once filming it or something.
Yeah.
There's loads of cookies in my browser. Would they work?
You know, we had this suspicion that you were really intelligent, Shrenik. And then I'm sure they'll work. They're smoking hot.
Right. Mattias, I wanted to ask you before I bring the call to a close, the recording to a close. Have you built any boats without using the kit, using a kit? Have you ever built any from scratch?
Yes, back in the day.
Yeah.
So I was a very active model builder. I mean, my first model was the Airfix 1-600 HMS Victory that came in a plastic bag, and this would have been in 1972 or 3. A friend and I bought a kit each and went home to his and put them together with some glue, and you know the story. But in my teens, I built a lot of model boats, radio controlled, and those were almost all of those were scratch built. I haven't got any. I've got one left, which is actually a steam paddle wheel, but it has sentimental value, but not much else. And so now when I took up the hobby again, I started in 2007, I think. So far I've only built kits, but I'm definitely planning to go down the scratch route again.
Great.
It has been a way of easing myself back into it, and also because my biggest fault as a youthful model builder was that I wanted to be finished yesterday. So I cheated and took shortcuts and never waited for things to dry properly. And in the end, I mean, I built a few nice ones and a few less nice ones, but in the end, I always felt that I hurried through them because I wanted to get to the end. So as an adult, I wanted to see if I was able to actually let things take the time they take. And it turned out that I was. But to find that out, I started with a couple of kits.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we should all raise a bench beverage to Mattias and to the bench. So thank you, Mattias, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Great job.
Well done, mate. Well done.
Cheers to the bench.